Welcome to this panel webinar on the journey towards developing quality in EAL provision. Developing outstanding EAL provision in international schools requires talented, determined, and well-informed leaders with a compelling vision who care deeply about impact and are willing to make the changes that need to be made so that their learners can achieve and succeed. At the Bell Foundation, we support international schools to evaluate, develop, and improve their leadership and educational provision for plurilingual pupils who use English as an additional language through ALFRE, Accreditation by Language for Results International, the Foundation's accreditation scheme designed to provide a stamp of excellence in EAL provision. In today's webinar, we're going to share two success stories of how two different international schools and their leaders that have been awarded accreditation by Language for Results International have approached the challenges of bringing the best out of the plurilingual learners. Before I introduce today's two speakers, I just wanted to very briefly explain the structure of today's webinar. First, each speaker will answer questions posed by me for about 15 minutes each. After that, they will take any questions that you may have. So please feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you. And my colleague Tom will collect them and post them to Jacob and Liam during audience question time. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Jacob Huckle and Liam Mernagh. Jacob Huckle has been teaching and leading EAL in China since 2012. He's currently head of multilingual learning at Dulwich College, Zhuzhou, China, and is also studying for a part-time doctorate in education at the University of Bath, researching multilingualism and interculturality. Oh dear, that's difficult to pronounce, isn't it? Interculturality in international schooling. As well as presenting at conferences and facilitating professional development workshops, he enjoys writing about EAL, multilingualism, inclusion, and intercultural understanding for various publications. And if you have never read his articles and book chapters before, I strongly recommend you have a good look at them. And Tom right now is actually posting a link so that you can access Jacob's written work. Jacob will be speaking to us about inclusive leadership for EAL, one of the dimensions of EAL in the ALFRE scheme. Liam Mernagh has been teaching for 12 years across 3 schools, 1 school in East London and 2 international schools in Qatar. Liam is currently completing his National Professional Qualification for Headship and has led EAL at his previous school, which has over 100 different nationalities and languages spoken. He recently led a highly successful ALFRE accreditation with the Bell Foundation, becoming the first school within the Orbital Education Group to receive exemplary in all 7 dimensions of the ALFRE framework. Liam will be focusing on EAL assessment, another key dimension of EAL in the ALFRE scheme. So without any further ado, hello and welcome Jacob and Liam, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you both in this webinar. So what time is it for you now, Jacob?
For me, let me check, it's 7 p.m. 7 in the evening.
And for you, Liam?
It's just gone past 2 o'clock.
So this is absolute dedication. Thank you for both of you. So I'm going to start with Jacob. Jacob, as you know, we often talk about the importance of a whole school approach to EAL provision. Does that resonate with you? And if so, how?
Yes, I think a whole school, like EAL, we need to see it as a whole school responsibility, a shared responsibility of all members of the community, leaders, teachers, teaching assistants, and parents have a role to play. So yeah, that does really resonate with me. And I think one thing I would like to mention here is the shift that we can change our way of thinking about EAL towards this idea of being a whole school responsibility and not something that is just the responsibility of the EAL team or the EAL teachers. So one person who's written about this, if you want to look it up, is Virginia Rojas, and she talks about a paradigm shift from these kind of medical models or approaches, support service approaches, where the EAL teachers are there to fix the the EAL students and to help them and before they can enter into the mainstream, shifting from that towards more of an ecological approach in which we see everyone as playing their part. The subject teachers, the classroom teachers have a role to embed the English, embed the language development into the content teaching. The leaders have a responsibility to build the policies and procedures and structures that are going to support the teachers in helping their and supporting their EAL students and developing their language across the curriculum. So I think that's, for me, it's that kind of more of that kind of ecological response in which all people are playing their part. And for me, that signals a shifting or changing changing in the role of the EAL leader. I think the leader's role in this kind of paradigm is not to be there taking the students, the EAL students, and supporting them. The EAL leader's role is to build the systems and the structures and the training and the support for everyone within the school community to provide that holistic approach. So the EAL leader is there as an advocate for the student. The EAL leader is identifying the students that might need additional support to access the curriculum, is holding the members of the community accountable for that support, equipping them through professional development to provide that support. So I think we can see that kind of once we accept that whole school approach and that shared responsibility, we then see our own role as EAL leaders or EAL teachers in a slightly different way.
Thank you so much. So kind of the EAL leader as a linchpin in that ecological system, if you like, or framework. Thank you. Just to let you know that Tom has just shared with you a link to Virginia Rojas's article that Jacob was talking about. So you can actually download it from the chat box if you like. So my second question for you, Jacob, is what does a whole school approach to EAL provision look like in your particular and specific setting?
I think, yeah, for us, as we work towards building a more inclusive approach for our EAL learners and for all of our plurilingual students, we realize that to have this shift and this shared responsibility required changes on 3 different levels. And I talk about this as the 3 Ps. So I talk about the first P is policy, the second P is practice, and the third P is the personal beliefs of the teachers and the parents and the students. And I think you need to, in order to build an inclusive program, an inclusive school for all learners, we need to have shifts on these 3 different levels. So we need policy that's going to ensure and set out the expectations in terms of language provision, in terms of support, in terms of assessment. So policy that might include a language policy. It might include specific EAL policies and procedures for entry and exit into EAL register and these kind of things, and expectations within other policies as well in terms of assessment policy. We're going to have within that the accommodations for EAL students or the way that the teachers are going to scaffold the assessment process for EAL learners. So that's in the policy, but just changing policy on its own is not enough. Of course, it needs to lead to change in practice. So then that's the second dimension within. So within our school, that looked a lot like equipping teachers with skilling up teachers in terms of like translanguaging. In terms of can the teachers, it's not enough just to say in policy that we are an inclusive school and we expect teachers to use students' home languages to support their learning. Are they equipped to be able to do that? Do they have the strategies and the routines to be able to do that within their classroom? And then in terms of personal beliefs, I'm talking here about shifting, changing the hearts and minds of the teachers, the other leaders within your school, and the parents, the students themselves, so that they see their home languages as valuable assets. They don't suffer no negative self-esteem because of their language proficiency, and that the teachers don't have a deficit mindset in which they're seeing the EAL students as some kind of problem in their classroom. So once we can start making shifts on those 3 levels, I think we can build more inclusive school, but that takes intentional action in each of those 3 dimensions.
Thank you. So clear strategic planning at those 3 levels. And I wonder, because sometimes we tend to believe that beliefs can't be changed. You believe what you believe, but I imagine that those changes in policy alongside professional development do lead to changes in perspectives. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's been a shift in my kind of approach to EAL over the years I've been doing this. Is I used to spend a lot of time giving teachers strategies and tips and ideas, and here's an activity you can use in your classroom to help, to scaffold learning for EAL students. I realized that that's not enough. We need to focus on changing the hearts and minds of teachers so that they can see this as their responsibility. They see this as something that they can do, and they look at their content in a different way to see the language and content integrated, that we're not asking them to do something extra on top of their subject teaching. We're just talking about how to scaffold and extend the learning of the students in their classrooms. So I definitely think it's possible to shift these attitudes and perspectives and the way of thinking of teachers. Maybe it takes a longer time than it does just to change a policy and to implement a new way of doing things. But if we can lead to that kind of change in mindsets, it can lead to more meaningful and longer term changes within the school community.
Fantastic, Jacob. Thank you. And I imagine part of the process as well is not just getting buy-in from the different participants in the school, but also making sure that they actively contribute to the creation of those policies and those practices. So my question to you is, how has your school community contributed to the creation of policies and procedures regarding use of languages?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, if we want to make policy actionable and we want policy to be living in practice and not just the documents within, shared on the computer system and printed out and stuck on the wall, for these policies to actually be used in practice, we need to give everyone a voice in the process. We need to make these things live in reality. So one example that we've done is to take some elements of our language policy and the language philosophy, in which we talk about an inclusive approach, and we talk about students using different languages alongside English to support their learning, and we talk about valuing plurilingualism. What does that actually look like in practice, and how do we navigate some of the complexities of that? For example, we found students using their home languages, but then we start to identify a few challenges, such as students maybe complaining, oh, that student said those people are saying something mean about me in their home language, and the teacher maybe doesn't understand. So what we realize is we need a more sophisticated approach to navigate some of these complexities, and to achieve that, we developed a charter of language rights and responsibilities, and the whole school community came together, and we launched that on International Mother Language Day last year. As part of that process, we asked the students to reflect on what are the kind of rights and responsibilities that we all have to ensure that we are an inclusive multilingual community. They suggested their ideas, and then the student leaders and the teachers, we worked together to put these into a charter. And then we're using that charter. So it talks about we have a responsibility to use our languages in a way that doesn't exclude other people. We have a responsibility to use our languages to help us learn. We have a right to use our languages to help us learn. We have a responsibility to use language respectfully and kindly, even when other people can't understand what we're saying. So we have these kind of rights and responsibilities enshrined in this charter that the whole school community has had a voice in producing. And we found that to be quite a powerful action that can lead and inform the decision making of teachers and students in their day-to-day life. So that was one example of how we not it goes beyond just building a buy-in for a vision. It goes to actual transformation and the school community coming together in a collaborative process.
That's amazing. Thank you. That's a wonderful example. Thank you, Jacob. My next question, which I will always, I'll also ask Liam later, is about data. So how important is data and evidence in informing what happens at your school, and how do school leadership and other school staff go about collecting the evidence that is needed to inform decision making?
So I think, yeah, data is really important, and it's a key part of any kind of EAL program or provision within school, any approach to EAL. But data data, we often have a lot of data in schools, and the question then is, how can we make that data meaningful and usable to teachers to inform what actually happens within the classrooms? So we have a kind of system where we use the data, and we identify which students are on the EAL register, and then informed by that, the data we have, the various data points we have from the assessment frameworks we use, which of those students have a high level need of support of scaffolding to access the curriculum, which of them have a medium and a low level need of support, because we found just designating students as EAL or not EAL is too blunt, and many of our students have complex language profiles. So we want to convey information to teachers about their students' language profiles and their English learning needs, so that they can support and scaffold them and extend them within the classroom. So when in our kind of school management system, information system, when the teacher logs on to take their register and the attendance list, they can see which of their students are low level need of support, etc. And at a glance, they can see that, and they can click through and then access the support strategies and scaffolding suggestions to help those students. So that's really an example of how we take all of the data we have, and then we think from the perspective of a busy teacher, what do they need to actually use this data to improve their practice within the classroom.
Fantastic, thank you. And we'll hear more about Liam later on the topic of data and assessment. So your school took part in accreditation for language of results accreditation for language for results international with the Bell Foundation. So I just wanted to ask you, how did the EAL-free accreditation process help shape your understanding of your school's EAL provision, and if it actually led to any concrete changes?
For us, yeah, it was a great process because it allowed us to go through holistically what we were doing and look at the different dimensions as part of the EAL-free accreditation framework. We looked at those different dimensions, from inclusive leadership to language policy to assessment, to student attainment. So we were looking at all these different dimensions, and it helped us really to take a pause and reflect on our progress over the last few years as we've been implementing different initiatives and improvements. We were able to take stock, reflect, to kind of celebrate our strengths, and also identify the areas to improve. So one of the areas for us that came out of the accreditation process was developing a more intentional approach to the language development across the curriculum. And we wanted to ensure that within our, going forwards, one area that we're working on now in our kind of improvement plan is to ensure that all unit plans and planning documents are in the future going to have explicit language development goals embedded within them, so that we're becoming more intentional and planned about the language development across the curriculum. So that was one kind of specific target and area for us that, with the support from the accreditation team, that was something that really helped us to clarify there's an area of further development, and now we've been able to start working on that since we achieved the accreditation.
Thank you. And you're an experienced leader, so sometimes leadership is something that evolves, and you understand it more deeply as you become more experienced and expert. So what is something that you think about differently in your role now compared to when you started?
I think for me, it's about vision and having a clear vision, and not only getting everyone on board with that vision, but bringing everyone into shaping that vision and having a voice and collaborating around that vision. So I think vision is really important, and then it's about inspiring and motivating people to work towards that vision, and then slowly but surely you can lead to deeper and more meaningful transformation within the school community. So vision and bringing everyone, inspiring and motivating everyone to work towards that vision, I think is a really important part of being an EAL leader, or any kind of leader, but especially within this area.
It's interesting you talk about inspiring and motivating. And you can also inspire and motivate senior leaders, can you not, from your role as EAL head or
Yeah,
lead?
exactly. Yeah, and yeah, getting them to see their own responsibilities and how how EAL kind of overlaps and has implications if someone is, for example, the leader of the extracurricular clubs within a school. Well, how are the EAL students participating in those activities and clubs, for example? So an area of the school leadership that maybe doesn't seem to have any relevance to EAL, our job is to bring them on board and to help them to see that and how we can support them in those processes as well.
Thank you. So what advice would you give a new leader in charge of developing more inclusive provision for multilingual students?
I think yeah, to go back to what I said earlier, it's about thinking about policy, practice, and personal beliefs, and realizing that if one of those three things is missing, it's you're going to struggle to lead to change. If we're just rewriting policies and we're not actually checking, does this lead to change in practice? So I think thinking on those three levels and shift, and then the other advice is shifting your own understanding of your role as an EAL leader away from being this idea that you're there to help the EAL students and to directly be there to give them lessons, and actually to equipping other people to take on that shared responsibility. I think that's the biggest kind of thing that we can take away from this in terms of our own kind of leadership approaches.
And sometimes I meet both EAL leads, but sometimes teachers who feel that they're not sufficiently empowered to do this. What could a teacher do? What could a teaching assistant do to support, to be that piece that you were talking about in that ecosystem, if you like? What would you advise to them?
I think yeah, it's I think it's nothing really unusual or special. It's just about taking care of every student within your class, seeing every student as an individual, um, seeing the strengths that every student brings to the classroom, and then working out how we can tap into those strengths. And I think that's there's other things that are more complex, and there's things we need to understand about language acquisition, and there are strategies we need to know. But the first point is simply about kindness and having an inclusive mindset, and then if that's where your starting point, and you see the students, the EAL learners, not as a problem that we need to fix, but as unique individuals who bring a great resources and assets to the classroom that you can tap into. I think that's the starting point for anyone in any role. And then once we've done that, we then go, for example, Bell Foundation has lots of strategies within their framework and documents that we can use. There's so much out there to help and guide us in terms of professional development.
Okay, thank you. And the last question for you, Jacob, what from me, what are the next steps in your journey as an inclusive leader? So where next?
Okay. Yeah. So for me personally, my journey over the years has been to contextualize EAL as part of a broader vision, both in terms of multilingualism. So my role as head of multilingual learning is broader than just EAL, and we see EAL as one part of this, but it also includes home language development, additional language development, language across the curriculum. So we're kind of contextualizing about that in that sense, and then also contextualizing my role as an inclusive leader of EAL in a broader vision for like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I've been learning a lot about that and the kind of intersectionality and how EAL intersects within our schools with race and culture and socioeconomic class and all of these kind of factors. I think is really important. Within international schools, we need to think about these things, and we need to think critically on how English is positioned as the dominant language, the legitimate language of learning, and how we can challenge that within our communities. So that's my own kind of journey, and I continue on that journey is to see language as one part of a bigger aspect of diversity and inclusion and equity. That's my kind of next steps really.
Thank you very much. That sounds fascinating. Thank you, Jacob. And as you were talking about intersectionality, I just wanted to draw participants' attention to the intersectionality between EAL and special educational needs. And we've just produced a piece of guidance at the Bell Foundation that if you want to know more about how to guide learners and to to be very mindful of how sometimes EAL and SEND can be conflated and shouldn't. Please access our guidance on SEND and EAL, which Tom will post a link to in the chat box in a minute. Thank you so much, Jacob. And now, Liam, I was wondering whether you'd like to come in on anything that Jacob said and add or reflect.
I'd just say, I think what Jacob mentioned off the bat about changing the mindset of people to be everyone's responsibility was the very, very first thing that I'd done as an EAL leader. We had it at our school originally where it was always seen as the EAL teacher's job to amend the science planning and amend the economics paper and do all these kind of roles, and it wasn't manageable, and we had to change the mindset straight away. And that was one of the most successful things that we had to do in order to get to where we were. Yeah, I think that was very important.
Thank you very much. So now, Liam, over to you. And thank you so much for sharing your success story with us. Well, I'd like to focus on the assessment practices that you put in place in your previous school, if I may. So my first question to you would be, what have you found to be an effective approach to EAL assessment during the admissions process? And how does the school ensure information gathered during that admission process and during assessment is shared between school staff? So admissions data, EAL assessment data, targets to inform decisions on language support.
Yeah, so I think initially it's important to know the backstory of my school. So my school is for the staff of Qatar Airways. So we have a lot of children who are based in other countries before they come to Qatar. So based on how it works in our international school, you have to arrive in, you got to get your QID to basically say that you can come to that school. So we have a lot of things to do before it gets to that point. So the children would normally do a Cat 4 test and to kind of establish their levels. And then anyone who came up with a below average verbal score, it gave me a little bit of a trigger to kind of have a Zoom conversation with the child, with the parents, get the backstory of how they were learning, were they doing it through English, get to know the child, get to know how, in a very, very informal conversation, what their strengths were, what the targets were that they needed to work on. And then using that information when they arrived in the school, I was able to then send out information to the staff about the child who was going to be arriving in, where they needed support, where they were sitting in regards to the Bell Foundation tracker. So staff really appreciated that. That was something that we didn't have in place when I first took over. And staff were getting very, very frustrated when all of a sudden a new child lands in and they've got 0 English and it's year 6 and they've already established a class, because with the international scene, people are moving and coming and going all the time. And now it's January and you've got a new child landing in who disrupts the kind of the ecosystem that you've got in place. So now that we were able to set that up, to give them the most information, to already have the support that was going to be in place already established, that kind of helped us an awful lot to ease some of the concerns that the staff would have had. And then when they arrived, we would normally kind of give them like 2 weeks to settle in before we started throwing any sort of assessments at the children when they arrived. But after those 2 weeks, we didn't do any sort of formal assessment. I know it's a lot of things that comes up on forums. What assessment are you using? What framework are you doing? What tests is people using? We kind of just done it by sitting in class. We had a combination of in-class sessions, withdrawn sessions with the children of their peers, so we could get an idea of what the children needed support on. And then I think one of the most important parts was that communication between the EAL teacher, between the parents, and between the class teacher, so they were able to establish what the main targets were. So I think that was very, very effective for us in allowing the children to transition into our school and have that smooth start. And then going forward, it was just ongoing assessment all the time. We found the Bell Foundation tracker was really helpful for us. We put that up in our shared drive. So that idea of everyone contributing and not just the EAL teachers, everyone had access to it, especially in our secondary, where you've got many teachers who are going to be working with them. They were able to see what they were working on, what they had achieved, what strategies that they needed to use based on the bands that they were working in. So that idea of everyone working together in the assessment part as well was really very beneficial for us.
Thank you. So Liam has just mentioned the Bell Foundation's EAL assessment framework for schools. Tom, do you mind posting the link so that our participants can access it if they haven't before? Thank you, Liam. So you kind of answered my next question, which was how important is ongoing assessment of EAL learners. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that, or shall we move on?
No, I think the main thing is just kind of that idea of communicating. I think when we've kind of first started, because again, with my backstory, when I first became responsible for EAL, we didn't have the Bell Foundation in place, and I felt we had lots of different things. Everyone was using their own frameworks, and the Bell Foundation allowed us to streamline between our primary and our secondary. It allowed everyone to be on the same page, and because everyone was working on the same framework and the expectations for everyone were the same, doing the ongoing assessments then became a lot easier because people were able to just go onto the drive, click evidence of where they saw someone was working on the targets, and then allowed us to set new challenges for the children as and when they needed it. Not that we were rushing them at any point, but when we all felt that as a group of teachers that they had achieved a target and then what the next target was going to be for that child.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, there are two EAL Foundation, if you like, versions, one for primary and one for secondary. But Liam, presumably you're saying you're talking about that coherence because we use the same bands.
Absolutely,
so from
yeah.
You know, from new to English to competent and fluent, and we also look at the same domains of language use. So
Absolutely.
speaking, reading and viewing, listening and writing. Okay, fantastic. What kind, in addition to the Bell Foundation EAL assessment for schools, what kind of tools have you found useful for eliciting various types of information and evidence that can help teachers and TAs plan the right support for EAL learners?
Well, I think initially it's just working alongside the children, having that first-hand knowledge of what the children are into, what they engage with, was fantastic for us to kind of just get a feel for it. But then we had got external things like the Flash Academy, Learning Village. We found were appropriate to our primary and our secondary phases. And again, it was another platform that allowed the children at home. You know, some people prefer to use the Duolingo app, so it was support at home, so that because what we found as well was a lot of our parents were EAL as well. So when they were going home, they weren't getting that English support. So we invested in platforms that they could go home and work independently on their language acquisition, so that it wasn't just a school thing. And then what we also done, which I'm sure the question might come up later on, is what we look to support our parents as well. You know, we talk about tools, it might not just be physical ones, but actually we ran English classes for our parents, because we found if parents couldn't engage with the learning, well, then we weren't having that partnership of the school and home working together. So those English classes were really, really successful. We ran 2 cohorts every year. We would have 40 in two separate groups. We would have 80 in total of parents coming in and wanting to work on their own English acquisition so that they could support their child. And then some other things that we use were immersive reader. We found that really helpful for children to be able to work at home if they needed to translate or highlight any text that they weren't sure of, if it needs to be explained, or they wanted to read it in their home language first before having an attempt at it in English. That was very, very important for us. It also helped with us with our communication with parents. So information that was going home we had the ability for parents to translate that into their home language as well. So they were tools that we found were very successful in kind of engaging all stakeholders in the school.
Thank you, fantastic. Do you have any advice for how to fit ongoing assessment of EAL learners into an already busy curriculum involving many other assessments?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It was for us just trying to find those little nuggets of time. For example, our gates opened 20 minutes before the register was taken, so we had a big push with some of our parents that they were in early, so that we got those 20 minutes to have time with the children. In Qatar as well, I know this would be different in international settings, but we have Arabic, Islamic, and Qatar history lessons. So any of our children that weren't going to those lessons, and we weren't allowed by the ministry to teach new information, they were our key moments. We were focusing on those times because, for example, in year 4, Arabic would be happening across that year group. So we were able to have different groups of children depending on their acquisition and their band level to support them during that time. That was massively important for us. In secondary, obviously, it was a little bit different. We had to use class time if they were working on a certain assessment, and they were, maybe our EAL children were working on a differentiated one or something that was aimed at their level. We were able to kind of withdraw the children during those sessions and have a look and see how they were working on those assessments, so that they didn't feel that they were alongside their, depending on the child. Some children preferred to kind of come out and do their own assessment. Some children preferred to be with their peers, and we kind of worked alongside what they required to help them. So I think time is the most important thing for everything in school. It's the biggest threat, I think, to most things that people want to implement and want to embed. But yeah, it's just trying to find even just those 15, 20 minute nuggets of times at the end of the day when there's releasing and you've got time in your class to almost have a TA at the back of the room. Yeah, it's just trying to find those little nuggets of time.
Brilliant advice, thank you. And what procedures did you have in place in your previous school to ensure really accurate, reliable, and fair assessment of these learners?
I think a lot of that was communication again. So we would have our EAL team, they would become part of the year group meetings. So staff were able to communicate what it was that assessment wise was going to be happening in class, what was going to be happening in English, maths, whatever the subjects were. And the EAL team had a voice to be able to support the staff and support the children and say, actually, you know what, little Billy is working on this. He's going to find that difficult. Can we adapt it? Can we change to this? Because what we want to do is to set up our children for success all the time. And what we don't want is children thinking that they can't succeed or there's something that they don't recognize. So that idea of the EAL team coming in as a supportive measure and being part of those meetings and not just kind of getting inundated with emails, but face-to-face conversations. I think that was probably the most successful thing that we embedded. Everything's about communication. I think if you're trying to do things through emails, intonation can get lost and focuses can get lost. And there's so many emails coming in at any point during the day. But that kind of protected time at the end of after school, where those meetings were happening, were invaluable for us, for staff to feel comfortable. They didn't have to go up 2 flights of stairs to go and try and find the EL department. We reached out to them, we came to them and found that time to support them. And I think they found that really valuable when working together.
So those meetings then kind of influence, sometimes could modify or result in a modified assessment, right?
Absolutely. And I could also just modify things that were happening in the lessons as well. So looking at planning. So if a teacher had maybe looked at the strategies that the bell had suggested, our EAL teacher would be aware of what was going to be put in place. Or maybe if someone had suggested something that they were going to be working on in English, the EAL teacher might say, do you know what, I think little Billy's might find that a little bit difficult. Have you looked at the scaffolds that are available that we can put in place? Have you looked at word mats that they're going to be able to need to succeed in that lesson? So the EAL, I always looked at it that the EAL team were always up-leveling the staff. So when they were having those suggestions, that teacher, when they're looking at planning for the next week, would be thinking those exact same tips that they had received. And we were constantly in that process of trying to improve teachers' thinking when they're looking at the planning stage. For us as well, having that framework, we printed off a copy for everyone. We encouraged them to go to every meeting with that on their laps. So when they were looking at maths or English, they were able to flick open to the band they were working on to look at the targets that they had been suggested and think, actually, is my child going to be able to succeed in that lesson? Is there something that I need to put in place? Have I thought of all the areas that I need? Have I looked at the support strategies that are in place to enable this child to succeed in whether it be the reading side, the writing side? So yeah, that became a really success story for us internally.
Thank you. Just for those listeners and participants who are not aware of the EAL assessment framework for schools, it also comes with an accompanying support strategies document that allows people who use the EAL assessment framework to choose support strategies to match to the different descriptors for the different bands. And there's also something which is a tracker that allows you to work on those in the same document. So both establish the band that the learners are currently working on, as well as set up the strategies. Thank you, Liam. So I don't know if you've covered everything you wanted to say, or would you like to add a little bit more detail about your experience of using the Bell Foundation Assessment Framework for schools at your previous school, Oryx?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note that I wasn't an EAL teacher, so I kind of have that idea. I was able to empathize with the staff and kind of know the concerns that they had. So when I became, I think it was really important. It was a really clever move. And I mean, if anyone has it in their school at the moment, if you don't have an SLT member that's ready, that's the EAL link. That's something that you absolutely need to establish. So that was great for me. But as I was looking at what we were doing as an EAL at the time, it was very mumbled. I didn't understand what we were doing. It didn't seem streamlined. So that's when I set about the task of looking at EAL frameworks that were out there. And the Bell Foundation kind of jumped out all the times in regards to the resources that they have. It's free, so it became a really easy sell to the SLT. The instructional videos that are there on YouTube were really helpful for me to understand in a very, very short space of time that this was the right framework and the right program that we wanted to use. When I was able to explain it then to the EAL team, the implementation stage then set in, and it was really, really helpful for me using the Bell framework. And then when we got to the accreditation stage, like what Jacob was saying, it allowed us to see where our strengths were, and it allowed us to kind of take a little pause and say, right, we're doing lots of things, but there's certain things we can do better, and there's certain things that we need to kind of amend and adapt. Our policies needed to be a little bit kind of tighter. And then being the EAL member as well, I think for representing SLT, EAL became a more consistent thing on the agenda at SLT meetings. So whilst we're saying it's everyone's responsibility, it's not just teaching staff, it's SLT as well. SLT needed to be. And I think it was the one thing that people started having conversation with me with from an SLT and from a board level. What are we doing now for EAL? What are we doing now? What are we working on? How's the progress going? What are we looking at? It became more of a conversation around the table, where sometimes I think in previous schools that I've been in, that was lacking. That wasn't a thing that was happening. So yes, I felt the framework and the accreditation process for me allowed me in a very, very short space of time to get up to speed as to what we were doing well and what we needed to do better, and to implement that in a really effective way.
Thank you. And now that you're mentioning accreditation, can I zoom in a little bit and ask you how the accreditation process helped shape your understanding of your school's EAL provision, and whether it led to any concrete changes in your school?
Yeah, I think it's a really effective audit. I think there's loads of things that are out there for EAL auditing, but I think this was the most in-depth one that allowed us to look at it in those dimensions. And what we did as a team, we were able to kind of focus our meetings a lot more around those dimensions and having a look and celebrating the things that we were doing well, but also having a look at action plans about what it was that we needed to do better. It allowed us to get more buy-in with the staff when it came to our after-school meetings. So we were able to say, this is something that we need to do better. So it was a really good process, and I felt it was a really inclusive one. It wasn't just me kind of barking at the EAL team saying, you need to do this better, we need to do that. It was everyone involved. We were all around the table. We all had our own opinions about what our strengths were and what we needed to do better. It opened up the conversation as to what can we do to make these things better. And I think, when we look at concrete things, one of the main things that we had a look at was partnerships. So we started to work with the British Council, and we set up, it was one of the things that we were just doing as I was leaving, is we were looking to create a partnership with the British Council. So when we were made aware of children who were coming into our school who had EAL needs or who were already in the school, that we could have a partnership with them, that they would go and have lessons outside of school, both for the children and for the families, and trying to have almost like a discounted rate because of that partnership, so that it wasn't just a school thing. It became a partnership of everyone. All the stakeholders were involved. And I think that was probably the most valuable change that we were making. And I think just tightening everything up was probably the most valuable thing that we had. It allowed us to just be a little bit, that word streamline keeps coming up all the time. We were more streamlined as a school as to where we needed to focus. When it became part of our SDP, everyone knew it was there. Everyone knew we were working on the same thing. we linked it to our whole school Monday meetings. So yeah, in that regards, it was everything was a lot more focused for us.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask you the same question as I asked Jacob before. What is something that you think about differently in relation to EAL provision now compared to when you started working with plurilingual learners?
And that first one again, just it's everyone's responsibility. I think, you know, I probably had blinkers on and thinking EAL, it's my job or it's the EAL teacher's job. And then when I kind of became the EAL lead, you start to realize that the most important thing is that it's everyone's responsibility. Everyone needs to be involved. Parents need to be involved. SLT needs to be involved. EAL teachers need to be involved. Everyone has that responsibility. And I know you mentioned about TAs having involvement. The Bell Foundation run CPD for teaching assistants that we set our staff on, and they found that really valuable. I think the strategies were massive for us as well that are provided on the tracker, because it wasn't people just pulling things from the internet. It was focused things that was backed by research. So it was easier to say to staff, look, you've got this wealth and this bank of knowledge, use it, try it, see what works. If it doesn't work, you know, try another strategy, another technique based on those ones. And just keep up encouraging staff to keep up leveling themselves, looking at those banks of ideas, the big ideas page. Yes, I think that, yeah, that idea of it's a community, what's that phrase? It takes takes the people to build a community kind of ethos. But yeah.
Thank you. And my last question from me to you is, what are the next steps in your journey?
Yeah, so for me, it's a little bit different. The school that I've moved to is a selective school where my previous school wasn't. So we don't really have the EL needs at my current school. But I want to obviously keep my hand in my EL knowledge and my understanding of it, because my long-term goal will eventually be to maybe move to another school in a higher position, or to work more closely with EL children. It's just building up my level of understanding, building up my strategies, building up my techniques that I want to be able to use. And I think looking at the partnerships that are out there that can help affect and have an impact on the children's learning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liam. Jacob, would you like to come in and comment or react on anything that Liam said?
I think I just one thing I've been thinking about, and I often think about in terms of assessment, because there are so many different assessments that we use in international schools. Yeah, and you mentioned Cat4 and other assessments that are being used. We have reading tests and etc. I think it's really important to be clear about the purpose of the different tests, why we're doing this test, and for what purpose we are using it, what decisions are we making using this test, and then to think, is this the most appropriate assessment to be using for that purpose? So there are a number of assessment tools that are commonly used in international schools that are maybe actually they were intended to be used with English native speakers, not multilingual learners, etc. People have been learning through English for their whole education. So we have to question how appropriate these tests are, and we need to be careful about making decisions using assessments that are producing data that's intended for other purposes. And so I think, yeah, that's my kind of comment and reflection on assessment, is being very clear about what the assessment was designed for, and then questioning whether this is the most appropriate assessment to be using for this purpose, being cautious and curious about the assessment so that we are triangulating with different data points, and we're not, rushing to conclusions when actually this test may be saying something about a very particular area, such as phonics, is not the same as comprehension, for example. And it's something that maybe, so for example, if a test is suggesting what Cat4 or whatever other assessments may call a verbal deficit, I don't like that term, but that's what would maybe used. Of course, that would be totally natural and normal for a student who's developing English proficiency when they're taking a test through English, and
They're learning.
Exactly, wouldn't necessarily need any kind of intervention or anything like that. It may trigger you to investigate further using other testing tools. So yeah, I think we need to be clear about the assessment of the purpose of the assessment, and then what we're using those assessments for. Is it appropriate? Is there an alignment there between what we're using it for and what the test was designed for?
Thank you so much. it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that this so far has been a masterclass in inclusive leadership. Um, so in a minute, we're going to move on to questions from participants, but I just wanted, before we move on, to say that Liam mentioned the Great Ideas page. So Tom has posted a link for you to access that in our chat, and there's a new page as well with principles that guide our practices, which is also worth looking at. And there's also an updated version of the support strategies that Liam was talking about, which you might want to also have a look at. If you don't mind, Tom, just...
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, so can I just mention that all the links that I'm putting in the chat, we will also send out as an email at the end with the recording. So don't worry too much about tracking it all, because we will collate all that and send it out to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So now we're going to move on to Tom, who has been watching the Q&A box and the chat box and collating the questions. So over to you, Tom, with questions from the participants.
Yeah, so there are a couple of there are a few questions that have come in. So one each for each of you, Liam and Jacob specifically, but what I'm going to try and do is combine them into themes. So there was one question that came through for each of you, but it's the same question essentially, which is kind of what, I guess it's, what does the EAL provision look like in your school? And the question was specifically, is EAL provision in your school through mainstream classes via adaptive classrooms, scaffolding and differentiation? And I guess there, as opposed to perhaps, withdrawal or other methods of intervention. So, I mean, I know it's quite a big question, but if you could maybe give us an overview of what that might look like in your individual schools.
I think I think it requires both of those things. So we within my school, we have the kind of vision that we've designed, which has three pillars. The first pillar is a language friendly ethos. So we are a language friendly school, and I would encourage anyone to check out languagefriendlyschool.org to learn more about that. So we're a language friendly school. We don't tolerate discrimination or bullying around language, and we try to be inclusive of all students' languages. So that's one thing. Then in terms of the teaching, we have the second pillar we talk about is the individualized language pathways. So we want a curriculum provision which all students can be in an English class that's appropriate to their level, in their home language and in additional language. So we have different language options within when the English lessons are happening. We have the English language acquisition classes as well as the English language and literature classes, so that we can provide different language classes that meet the students' need, including EAL classes. And then the third pillar is the language development across the curriculum, and that's where the teachers are involved in scaffolding and differentiating for all the learners in their classroom, including the EAL students. So it's a combination of both targeted, specific, specialized instruction in learning English that's suitable for the students' needs, and also embedding those academic English skills within the curriculum. I think both of those are important.
Right, thank you very much. And Liam, what about in your school? What is it?
Yeah, for us, we kind of had, we kind of looked at it through in-class support and withdrawn support. So, for example, if it was someone who was very new to English, we would have 3 lessons of withdrawn support where they would come out, they would work on specific areas, and then 2 classes where the EAL teacher would sit in and support through English lessons. If mostly we would target English lessons depending on the band that they were in. And then that also encouraged, like what Jacob kind of said, the teachers to have to differentiate and use strategies and use skills and use those kind of big ideas themselves. But yeah, that's how we split it. But again, I think that was one of those things that when we first started was kind of contentious as well, because staff felt that it was the responsibility of EAL, the EAL team, and they should be withdrawn all the time. But we had to have that shift again of moving away of just withdrawn all the time. So we had that kind of 50-50 split.
Yeah, and that's certainly from sort of the encounters we have with a lot of schools, is that we typically find people often have a balance. Because I think, it's, as much as we say as much as it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if everyone was kind of in some kind of inclusive classroom where everyone could be there. It's about finding a balance that works, certainly. And there was a couple of specific questions about the initial assessment as well, because I think Liam, you mentioned the Cat 4 test, for example. And there was a couple of questions around whether that was done all through English or whether there was some home language support there, or how you ensured that those Cat 4s were accessible to learners.
Yeah, so with the Cat 4 only available in certain languages, we've done it just as a pinpoint to try and identify anyone who kind of may need that support. Because what we found is we would get a lot of our parents that would say they felt that they wouldn't get into the school if they didn't have English, if they didn't have the English language. So with the verbal score allowed us, it was almost just acted as a trigger point for us to kind of say, yes, we need support. So the Cat 4 test was done online with our admissions team. If they weren't able to access it, we stopped. It wasn't something that we continued with. It was conversations with the teacher or with the parents as well. And again, that would trigger I need to meet with them on Zoom, have a conversation, and try and establish the level of language acquisition. Because all of this, the whole reason for doing it was to basically allow our teachers to have knowledge on that child before they arrive in the classroom of where they sat on those acquisition bands, where they needed support for when they started on the first day. And then the next couple of weeks is when we started to build up that bigger picture.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's really fascinating. And there's one question that's just come in, which I think is a really important question. We've only got about 3 minutes, so I'll ask you for as succinct answer as possible. Probably I'll go to Jacob first for this one, actually, because it's this is from Sally, and she says buy-in from everyone is vital. What types of things can we use to get some of our less willing staff on board? Because we all know the type. Unfortunately, they exist. Any thoughts on that, Jacob?
I think every teacher wants to be the best teacher possible for their students. So I think we need to frame it as that. And I think we need to sometimes we present EAL as something extra that teachers need to do on top of their main job of teaching. But I think it's about reframing that. So that's why I know why we often, as EAL teachers, we say things like every teacher is also a language teacher. But actually, I stopped saying that because I see that then people see that as something extra you need to do. And I say that if you're the economics teacher in your school, you need to be an effective economics teacher for the students in your economics class. And you cannot do that without scaffolding the language for your multilingual learners. And extending their language so that they can express their understanding of economics through English. Yeah. So that's my approach has been to reframe it as about not doing something extra as well as teaching your economics, because who has time for that? It's about teaching your economics or your maths or whatever effectively to the students in your classroom. And I found we can get a lot of buy-in through that approach.
Great, thank you. Anything to add to that, Liam?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the teacher standards. I think that's the things that we kind of bring people back to all the time. We bring people back to policies. We've got an EAL policy. We've got our SDP that talks about what our main focus was. For us as an international school, EAL is always there on the SDP. So once you can bring it back to that, I don't really think that teachers can argue it. They want to be seen. They have to be seen to be getting the best out of their children, out of their children, and you don't want to say non-negotiable, but teaching standards kind of they have to be doing that.
Great, thank you. That's really very helpful. We have got a couple of other questions, but I think we're out of time, so I'm going to pass that over to Silvana. And apologies if we didn't get to your question. Over to you, Silvana.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you so much to you both, Jacob and Liam, for such useful advice, guidance, ideas. Just listening to your experience and the amazing things that you've been able to achieve and accomplish are just extraordinary. So thank you so much. Lizzie, could I ask you to share our presentation, please, our PowerPoint? So that brings us to the end of our webinar. But before we finish, here is the link to the Bell Foundation's webpage. You can see it on that page. Particularly, that gives you a lot of information about EAL accreditation scheme for international schools. On the next slide, the calendar of our online courses for academic year 2024-25 and for our next webinar will be published in the next few weeks. So please keep an eye on the website or sign up to our newsletter for more information. Let me give you a little bit of information about the upcoming courses. So on April the 17th, we've got a course starting on assessing the language proficiency of learners who use English as an additional language. The kinds of things that Liam was talking about, using the EAL Foundation EAL assessment framework for schools, for example, the support strategies, etc. So if you're interested in that aspect of today's webinar, make sure to check our website for more information about this course. And then on the 29th of May, we've got a new course on leading on EAL assessment, which is really and particularly useful for EAL calls, leads, etc., or for those members of staff who are thinking about becoming an EAL or inclusion lead. Finally, a quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar. And when you leave the webinar, a post-course evaluation form will appear, and you will also get a link to the same form in the email tomorrow. Would be really very grateful if you could spend a few moments to complete it, as your views always help us shape our future program, both of webinars and of courses. So thank you very, very much for taking part in today's webinar, and thank you again, Jacob, Liam, and Tom, for such an inspirational webinar. We look forward to seeing you all again in our next webinar. Please check our website to find out more, and goodbye from us at the Bell Foundation.